Welcome to our study of the book of Daniel. This lesson was presented on Thursday evening, 25th March 2021, in a Zoom class for the British Bible School as the UK is making plans to come out of lockdown. We're in our penultimate lesson, chapter 11. We'll continue looking at Daniel's final vision. Again, we're going to see a lot about the north, the king of the north versus the king of the south. This is the outline we're using for our study. We've been approaching Daniel from a chronological standpoint as much as I can. As I mentioned, we are in our next to last lesson. We're going to be in chapter 11. This particular chapter we could divide up in this way. We've already looked at this first section, the first 10 verses, but we're going to see the king of the north invading and defeating the king of the south, a new king gaining control, the king of the north turning against the Holy Covenant, and then finally a king who would do as he pleased. As we have been looking at this in a timeline, this is roughly where we are. These last few chapters, chapters 5 and 6, and chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, all taking place in a very short amount of time. As we saw in chapter 5, the ending of the kingdom of Babylon, the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire, and then that Medo-Persian Empire in chapter 6. And chapters 9, 10, 11, 12 were given during the Medo-Persian Empire, but they're about the future of the Israelite people. Let's begin just very quickly with a quick review of our last lesson. In chapter 10, we saw that Daniel had been mourning for 3 weeks when he was by the river Tigris. He had a vision of a man. The man seems to have been terrifying because seeing him drained Daniel of all energy, and it would seem that he passed out. This being revived and strengthened Daniel. He had a message for him of what would happen to the Jewish people in the future. And we had a glimpse of a war going on in what I'm calling the spiritual realm between God's forces and the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Michael came to help, we are told. The one talking to Daniel was about to return to this conflict, but first he had dependable, truthful information to give to Daniel. Once the prince of Persia was dealt with, the prince of the kingdom of Greece would arrive. We looked at the beginning of the message that Daniel was given in our last lesson, the beginning of chapter 11, which had to do with the coming rulers of Persia who can be identified in history, as well as a powerful king who would then arise, being Alexander the Great. The kingdom was broken up due to Alexander's early death and divided between 4 of his generals. The vision in chapter 11 centers on 2 of those kingdoms, identified as the king of the south, which is the Ptolemies down in Egypt, and the king of the north, which is the Seleucids up in Syria. And we saw some of the detail of what would initially happen in our last lesson, with alliances and murders and a time of peace. We left off the last time, chapter 11, verse 10, with the sons of the king of the north mustering a large army to attack the king of the south. So this is where we're going to pick up. We're going to continue looking at this in the same way we did our last lesson, which dealt with the first part of chapter 11. We're going to first look at the vision, and then we will add to that an historical interpretation. The sons of the king of the north would continue to wage war on the king of the south, continuing to invade as far as his fortress. The king of the south would eventually reach the point when he had had enough, and he would come out and fight with the king of the north. He too would raise a great army, and he would win this particular battle, this war. When the army, the king of the north, left, he would be elated, and he would be responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands, but he would not prevail. The king of the north would then raise an even larger army than he had had, and after some years he would come with a great army and abundant supplies. Even the violent amongst the Israelites would lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they would not be successful. The king of the north would then come and throw up siege works and capture a well-fortified city. The forces of the south would not be able to withstand against this army, not even the elite troops. There would be no strength left. The king of the north would do whatever he wanted. None would stand before him. He would prevail in the beautiful land with the power to annihilate within his grasp. He would come with the strength of his entire kingdom and bring terms for alliances. He would give the king of the south a daughter in marriage to destroy the kingdom, but it wouldn't turn out to his advantage. He would then turn his face to the coastal areas and capture many of them, but a commander would put an end to his shameful conduct and make him pay for it. He would then turn his attention once again to his own fortresses. He would stumble and fall, but not be found again. Another would arise in his place, who would send out someone to collect tribute to enhance the splendor of the kingdom, but after a few days he would be destroyed, but not in anger nor in battle. Something would happen to him which seems to be somewhat accidental. The interpretation we're going to give is based on history, and this interpretation can be found in most commentaries. We know that this king of the north at this point is Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, and he attacked Egypt. Ptolemy the fourth Philopater was the ruler at the time, and he fought against him at the Battle of Raphia, and defeated him, which granted a 1-year term of peace. It was Antiochus III who attacked Ptolemy the fourth, or to Ptolemy the fifth, Epiphanes. He had raised another large army greater than before, and he attacked again later. Many would rise against the king of the south this time. And this is Philopater's son Epiphanes. Amongst those who rose up against him was Philip III, king of Macedonia, who allied himself with Antiochus III. And the text mentions some of the Israelites. Many warlike Jews allied themselves with Antiochus III and helped him to victory. Homer Haley wrote, "When Antiochus had beaten Ptolemy, he seized upon Judea. And when Philopater was dead, his son sent out a great army under Scopas, the general of his forces, against Cold Syria, who took many of their cities, and in particular of our nation, which, when he fell upon them, went over to him. Yet it was not long afterwards when Antiochus overcame Scopas, and afterward the Jews of their own accord went over to him and received him into Jerusalem and readily assisted him when he besieged the garrison which was in the citadel of Jerusalem." Actually, that was not Homer Haley who wrote that. He's quoting there Josephus, who wrote that in his Antiquities of the Jews. But Homer Haley commented, "In this striking way, if credit may be given to Josephus, the Jews brought upon themselves the very troubles which they were forced to undergo in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes." So later on, this inviting Antiochus the Great in was not going to go well for them. It's going to prove to be their own undoing. Antiochus III would take the well-fortified city of Sidon, where the Ptolemy general Scopas had taken refuge after his defeat at Panium in 198 BC, which gave Israel to the Seleucids. Scopas now served Ptolemy V Epiphanes. The king of the Seleucids on this occasion would be unbeatable, would gain control of all of Palestine. Scopas was forced to surrender. Antiochus would then seek to establish his home front by exercising his power over the Jews. After all, you want to have your front lines as far south towards Egypt as you can. And now that he had Judea, he could do that. He also contracted a marriage between his daughter, Cleopatra, and Ptolemy V. Now, she was only a child at this time, as was Ptolemy. This, by the way, is not the Cleopatra of Mark Antony fame. She lived about 100 years later, but this seems to be the first of the Cleopatras of the Ptolemy dynasty. And so this is the first of the Cleopatras. I think the one married to Mark Antony was the fifth one, if I remember correctly. But he wanted to do this to bring down the Ptolemy kingdom. But he thought his daughter would back him when he instigated a conflict. But he didn't. His daughter instead backed her husband. I guess that's what any good wife should do. Antiochus III then turned his attention to the coasts of the Roman province of Asia in 197, then to Thracia in 196, and to Greece in 192. It was Roman generals who put an end to his attack on their dominions in 191 at Thermopylae, where he was defeated by Achilles Glabrio. And in 190, he was defeated at Magnesium by Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiaticus. And this was the beginning of Rome's rise to power. Antiochus then was shackled by a crippling tax imposed by the Romans, lost all property west and north of the Taurus Mountains, all territory gone. He also had to send his son Antiochus to Rome as a hostage for his future good behavior. He then would turn his attention to his own territory and to Persia, where he would die in a battle caused by plundering a temple at Elamus. So it wasn't a real war, but it was because he was plundering a temple. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, had two sons, Seleucus and Antiochus. So he was succeeded by Seleucus IV Philopator, who was the next king, and he sent his prime minister Heliodorus throughout the kingdom to raise funds to pay that crippling tax imposed by the Romans. And he would do this by robbing temples. Temples were where people kept their treasures. I guess you could call them the banking system of this era in history. They keep their treasures, their jewels, their gold there in the temples because temples were considered to be safe. You can read about what he did here, by the way, in 2 Maccabees chapter 3. In particular, he also sent Heliodorus to Jerusalem. And from what I read, he sent him to Jerusalem to requisition the temple treasures there, but it would seem Heliodorus failed to get them. Seleucus was killed later by Heliodorus through treachery, and Heliodorus was later assassinated as well. All this intrigue, all these plots, all this assassination going on. We continue in verse 21. In his place, Seleucus IV's place, there would arise a despicable person, as the Net Bible renders him. Some translations have there a contemptible person, who had not yet been given royal honor. He would come in without warning, take over the kingdom by deceit, by flattery. Armies would be utterly swept away before him in defeat, including, it mentions, the covenant leader, who would be destroyed. From that time on, alliances would be made with him, but he would act treacherously. He would not uphold the alliances. He would ascend to power with only a small force. In other words, with only a few backing him. Without warning, he would come into the richest areas and do what his predecessors had not done. In other words, he's going to succeed in areas where they had not succeeded. He would scatter among the people, plunder, spoil, property. He would devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. The king of the south would raise a large and very he would rouse history and think it's the king of the south with a large army, and then the king of the south would raise a large and very powerful army, but he wouldn't be successful because of plots made against him. Even those who ate his food, the text says, would attempt to destroy him. So we find treachery in his own household. His army would be swept away, and many would be killed in battle. Now, neither of these two kings are good. Both are trying their best to do evil. They would speak lies at the same table. Both would try to deceive the other, but to no avail because it wasn't time yet. The king of the north would then return to his land greatly enriched, but his heart would be set against the holy covenant. He would do his worst and go home. So let's have a look at what this is talking about. Again, this interpretation that's based on history can be found in most of the commentaries. This despicable person would be Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We talked about him before in the previous visions. Now, after Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great died, and then succeeded by Seleucus IV. When Seleucus IV was assassinated, his son would be expected to inherit the kingdom. But that was not to happen. And this is the reason why. Antiochus IV had been held as a hostage in Rome, but near the end of Seleucus' 12-year reign, he sent his son Demetrius to take Antiochus' place. I don't know why he did it. I think it was something to do with he thought he needed Antiochus' support at this point in his reign. But while Antiochus was traveling home, Seleucus was assassinated. Using flattery, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, won the support of Eumenes and Attalus, kings in the province of Asia, and they helped him to gain the throne of the Seleucids. The Seleucids peacefully accepted his rule. Many would make treaties with him, but he would work deceitfully against his allies. He would gain power even though he didn't have that many behind him. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a shrewd man. He would weigh his best opportunity before he made his move. He set a precedent for lavish giving to the people to ensure his stability. And it said he would even go through the streets giving away money. He would use cunning going against enemy fortresses. And he would succeed in all of this for a while. He would engage Ptolemy the sixth Philometor in war. This was in 170 BC. And Ptolemy the sixth would be defeated, partly by sedition, partly by desertion of his army. This was at the Battle of Pelusium. You can read more about this, by the way, in 1 Maccabees chapter 1. Some close associates of Ptolemy VI would aid in his defeat. Antiochus bribed some of his generals. Many in Ptolemy's army were killed. Apparently, he and Antiochus Epiphanes were discussing all sorts of joint projects at this time, jointly doing things together. But these were only masks for their evil intentions, although neither would ultimately benefit. God had pointed that both of these kingdoms are going to fall. Antiochus Epiphanes did return to his country with much plunder. He deposed the high priest in Jerusalem, who was Onias III, who had been a high priest from 175 to 170. History tells us that he had him killed, and he installed a Jew that he thought he could trust, I guess that he thought he could manipulate, as high priest. Significant here because this was the end of the lineage of the high priests being descended from Aaron, and the beginning of the high priest being appointed or even at times purchasing the office. So if they see things not going well on the Judean front as well. This brings us to verse 29. At a later time, he would return to the south, but this time it's going to be different. Ships of Kittim would come against him, causing him to be afraid and to withdraw. He would turn back enraged and take out his rage against the Holy Covenant. You should have figured out by now that this phrase Holy Covenant is referring to the Jews. He would profane the fortified sanctuary and stop the regular burnt offerings. He would set up the abomination that causes desolation. He would seduce the unfaithful to the covenant with smooth words, with flattery. But those who were faithful would stand firm and take action. The wise among the people would teach the people, although they would for many days fall by the sword and flame and be imprisoned and plundered. When these things happened, they would receive a little help, but very little help. Many would join with them deceitfully, though, even causing the wise to stumble. But this would result in their being refined and purified and cleansed until the time of the end. Again, what this is talking about historically seems to be, at least in my estimation, the atrocities of Antiochus Epiphanes. And this is the explanation you can find, at least in most of the commentaries. Antiochus would return to attack Egypt again. He did this in 168 BC. But this time he was not successful as he had been the first time. This was because ships from Cyprus, that was Kittim, known as Kittim at the time, it was a Roman kingdom, came with Roman troops and ordered him to withdraw. And he would return in humiliation and vent his rage on the temple and the Jews. The story is recorded that Popilius Linnaeus, the general of the Roman army, met Antiochus when he arrived in Egypt. He extended the demands of the Roman Senate, while Antiochus extended his hand in supposed friendship. The general told him that he'd better read the demands before extending his hand. Antiochus said that he would take time to consider those demands, and it prompted Linnaeus to draw a circle around Antiochus and told him that he needed to have an answer for the Senate before he stepped out of the circle. And this is apparently where we get the expression drawing a line in the sand. Antiochus then read the demand from Rome that he leave Egypt. He decided not to fight Rome at this time and stated that he would withdraw. But he then vented his rage on the Jews. He couldn't take on Rome at this point, so he took it out on a small nation. He killed 40,000 Jews, sent many into captivity. He made use of the apostate Jews, and there would be a division amongst the Jews. There were those who forsook God and those who remained true to God. There are those who were seduced by what they saw as being the modernization of the Greeks, and they were very much longing for that Greek way of life. And there were those who remained true to what God had written. Antiochus then sent men and officers who would profane the temple. They caused the daily sacrifices to cease. We looked a little bit about that in an earlier vision, back in chapter 8. He caused the temple worship to stop for 3.5 years. This included not only the daily sacrifices, but the annual festivals, the Sabbaths, the ceremonial observances, including the dietary laws. Circumcision was prohibited under pain of death. The books of the law were destroyed, and anyone having a copy of it would be put to death. He erected a statue to Zeus in the temple, the abomination that causes desolation. He offered pigs on the altar, sprinkled the entire temple area with pig broth. He continued to use apostate Jews while the faithful remained loyal to God. The teachers of the Jews would also suffer death or captivity during this time of persecution. But the persecution would serve to strengthen the Jews by eliminating those who were unfaithful to God. The teachers would find some support. Historically, this came from the Maccabees family. Some would appear to be faithful, but in reality, some were spies. Not the Maccabees, but the ones who were spying out for Antiochus. The persecution, though, would work out for the best of the people. They would have to suffer until God brought the Seleucids to an end, because this is what he had appointed. Now, some scholars differ with this view, and that's because of this reference to the abomination that makes desolate. This we know from Matthew 24 fits in with the Roman siege and destruction of Jerusalem, which ended in 70 AD. But some have concluded that this part of the prophecy is talking about that and advances over 200 years into the future. I don't believe this fits the time scale of what is happening here. I think a better explanation is this one, that what the Romans did in 70 AD duplicated what Antiochus Epiphanes had done earlier. Emmanuel Doherty wrote this, explained it this way. This was what Jesus called the abomination that maketh desolate, referring in the first century to those abominable acts being duplicated by the Romans in AD 70. And I think tying those two together is what's going on here. This leads us then to this last section of the text. The king would then do as he wanted. He would exalt himself even above all the gods and speak presumptuous things against the real God. He would succeed until the time of wrath was completed. He would not respect the gods of his fathers or the one women loved and worshipped, at least that's the way Net Bible translates it, but he would elevate himself above all of them. He would honor the God of fortresses, a God not worshipped by his fathers. He would honor this God with gold and silver, precious stones, and costly gifts. He would attack the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledged him he would load with great honor. He would make them rulers over many and parcel out the land for a price. At the time of his end, the king of the south would attack him. The king of the north would then come on the south like a storm, like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and a large armada of ships. He would pass through countries like a flooding river and enter the beautiful land, which you should figure out by now is referring to Israel. Many would fall, but Edom, Moab, and most of Ammon would be delivered out of his hand. He would extend his power against the countries, and Egypt would not escape. He would have control of the treasures of Egypt, gold, silver, and all the precious things. The Libyans and the Ethiopians, the Cushites, some translations have, would submit to him. He would then receive news from the east and north that would alarm him, and he would leave in a tremendous rage and to destroy as well as wipe out many. He would pitch his tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain. His end would come with no one to help him. So what's this talking about? Some scholars see a transition in verse 36. I would agree with them, to no longer be talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. Others, though, take the view that this is still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. David Recton in the Truth for Today series, and S.R. Driver in the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges series takes the view that this is still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. Neil Pryor, also writing for the Truth for Today series, and Emmanuel Doherty took the view that it's referring to events concerning Antiochus Epiphanes of which we have no record. And while it's true that at least some of what we read in those initial verses could fit Antiochus Epiphanes, the rest doesn't correspond to what we know of him and his death. So an interpretation that I believe is based on what we know about history, this is the one that Jim McGuigan in his commentary, Homer Haley in his commentary goes with, is this. They both emphasize that this king could not be Antiochus Epiphanes. In fact, even notice that the designation of the north, at least initially in verse 36, is no longer present, although he becomes king of the north later in this text. One thing we know is Egypt did not move against Antiochus Epiphanes again. He didn't fight a war with Egypt after 168, let alone win one. He did not conquer Libya or Ethiopia or Cush. In fact, Antiochus Epiphanes had a terrible time raising funds. He was robbing temples to get the tribute to pay to the Romans. Others have suggested that this might be Herod the Great. But Herod the Great was never at war against Egypt. The king now appears to be the Romans. So it would seem we have a jump of about 100 years. I suggest this does fit the scope of the book. The description here fits that of Roman policy and the character of Rome at this time. The battles fit what Rome was doing. Associated with Rome, though, was a period of distress among the Jews. And this will permit a conclusion as well of the vision being 70 AD when we get to chapter 12, and that fits in well with chapter 12, as well as the earlier visions we had about this fourth kingdom. There's nothing here in the text that the Romans couldn't do, and there's nothing in the text that the Romans didn't do. The Romans, we know, exalted and magnified themselves as the highest of gods. They would prosper until the outpouring of God's wrath. Their main concern was their success and power. They forsook the gods of their fathers. They did whatever it took to achieve their purposes, even to the worship of foreign gods. But in reality, this was a political expedient. They really, in many ways, worshipped no gods, but went through the motions to gain power. Their real god, I guess, was the god of war, the god of fortresses, as the text says. They made alliances with nations, enlisted their armies and gods to help them. In fact, whoever acknowledged them would prosper. Those whom Rome conquered would submit to Rome. They would be permitted to keep their nationalism, pay taxes, and receive political promotions. That this king was helped by a foreign god, Homer Haley took to be God, the God of the Jews, using Rome in their conquests as he would use them to destroy Jerusalem. And maybe Homer Haley's right there, but then again, maybe he's not. The king of the south would attack this king. The Ptolemies moved against Rome. It was Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, aided by Mark Antony, who pushed against Rome, and Rome under Octavian, who was the general at the time, declared war on Egypt. Octavian gained the upper hand, and Mark Antony's army on land became demoralized, with many deserting to Rome. The end came quickly. Mark Antony committed suicide. Cleopatra tried to woo Octavian, failed, and she committed suicide. And with the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, the Ptolemy kingdom fell, being the last of the Grecian kingdoms. The Romans would then enter the beautiful land. They entered Judea. Homer Haley explains some of how this would happen. In 63 BC, two brothers were fighting over the position of high priest and king when Rome intervened. Pompey, the Roman general stationed in Syria, entered the picture to help settle the quarrel. He settled it by annexing the Jewish kingdom to Rome. He continued the conquest by overthrowing many countries, but Edom, Moab, and portions of the children of Ammon escaped. I think you can see how this perfectly fits in with the prophecy that we have here in Daniel. Herod went to Rhodes, pledged support to Octavian, even though he had been a supporter of Mark Antony. Edom and Moab and Ammon, though, did escape Roman rule. Octavian, he became Augustus Caesar later on. He moved on into Egypt, and the country surrendered. Ethiopia and Libya were now under Roman rule. Now, it's not easy to identify what the news from the north and east was. We know that north of Rome were the Germans and Gauls, and they gave pretty well perpetual problems to the Romans. East were the Parthians, and they were constantly harassing them as well. But whatever this news was, we know that Rome had enemies, they had opposition, but they were still able to go out and destroy many. They were successful, they were prosperous, and they settled wherever they wanted. And in particular, they settled their authority in Jewish lands. But they would not be ultimately unstoppable. They would prosper until God was ready for them to fall. And with that, we reach the end of chapter 11, with chapter 12 still ahead of us for next week as we bring this vision and this book to a conclusion. Let me finish with a summary before we get to some lessons we can learn, but finish with a summary that Homer Haley gave of all this section of visions. He said, in summary, the first 7 weeks of the 70 weeks vision of Daniel covered the period from Cyrus to the building of the temple and the walls of the city in the days of Nehemiah and Malachi. The last week, the 7th, was dealt with in Daniel 9:27. It will be covered more fully in chapter 12. That left the 62 weeks in between, which now have been covered by the Between the Testaments period in chapter 11. Also, this deals with the 4 beasts of Daniel's vision. The first beast represented the Babylonian kingdom, fulfilled in the death of Belshazzar. The second and third beasts, the Persian and Macedonian empires, and the beginning of the fourth, the Roman, were covered in chapter 11. And the closing period of the Jewish and Roman kingdoms in the 12th chapter. So that's where we're heading as we go throughout the rest of this book. So, What lessons can we learn from this bit of history that we find foretold in Daniel chapter 11? Let me suggest 3. We can obviously see, as we've been seeing in every chapter, that it's God who's in control. God is the one who's in control even of history. One thing I think we can also see, we can learn, is that people haven't really changed, have they? Here's what Warren Wiersbe said about this. As you review the history of the relationship between Egypt and Syria and the family relationships among the Seleucids, you can't help but realize that human nature hasn't changed over these thousands of years. The ancient world had its share of intrigue, political deception, violence, greed, and war. The lust for power and wealth drove men and women to violate human rights and break divine laws, to go to any length to get whatever they wanted. They slaughtered thousands of innocent people, plundered the helpless, and even killed their own relatives just to wear a crown or sit on a throne. And how true that is it not? A lot of what's going on here amongst the nations, we still see going on in nations today. Mind you, we use more modern methods to do it, but it's still going on. And our final lesson that we see is that God will do what he says. Again, quoting from Warren Wiersbe, he said, while God is not responsible for the evil that men and women have done in the name of government and religion, he is still the Lord of history and continues to work out his plans for humankind. And with that, we'll conclude this particular lesson. Pleased that you were able to join us once again. And we'll have one more lesson in this series, which will go live next week. So we pray that you'll have a good week, good weekend, and continue to stay safe.